This is a revision video for the final biology topic in AQA GCSE Combined Science. These are pure factual recall questions because recalling facts from the specification makes up 40% of the marks for GCSE Science. Because this is a big topic, I've split out just the combined science questions into this video, and then there's a separate video that you need to watch if you're taking GCSE Biology, which you might call triple science. There's a link in the description below to all of the questions so you can work through them at your own pace and then use this video to check your answers. Unit 7 starts with quite a lot of terminology and vocabulary, and it's worth you having a particular definition for each one of these on a flashcard that you can memorise. Interdependence is the idea that within a community, every species is depending on other species, both for food but also for things like shelter, pollination and seed dispersal. A population is all of the organisms that are the same species that live in a particular habitat, whereas a community is all of the organisms of all the different species. A habitat is a place where an organism lives, and an ecosystem is the interaction of the community of living organisms with the abiotic parts of their environment. In other words, it could include things like the pH of the soil, the amount of water that's available as rainfall, and also the temperature. This is important because the more interdependent an ecosystem is, the better able to resist change it will be. We might describe it as being more resilient. A stable community is one where all the species and environmental factors are in balance, and therefore the population sizes remain fairly constant. In the past, there have been questions about this where they've asked you about a garden and why it might or might not be a stable ecosystem, and it's been necessary for you to talk about the number of new organisms coming into the garden and also the number of organisms that are leaving. Biotic factors are living things that can impact where an organism can live. So this could include whether there are predators, whether there's food availability, whether there are competition with other species, and also whether there are diseases. In contrast to this, abiotic are the non-living things that impact where an organism can live. Typical abiotic factors that we might consider include light intensity, particularly for plants that need that light for photosynthesis, the temperature, the moisture levels, soil pH and also the mineral content, so whether there are nitrate ions and magnesium ions available, wind intensity, carbon dioxide levels if we're thinking about plants, where again this is important for photosynthesis, and also if we're thinking about aquatic animals, then oxygen levels, which they'll need for respiration. For non-aquatic animals, we don't really need to worry about this because the levels of oxygen in the atmosphere are so high and also so ubiquitous everywhere. It's important that you know the proper names for the pieces of equipment that we use to assess abiotic factors. So to test for soil pH or soil acidity, we use a pH probe. To test for light levels, we use a light meter. To test for water levels, you use a moisture probe. And to assess species coverage, you use a square or rectangular frame called a quadrat, which may or may not have internal divisions. You may be asked to write an extended method which explains how you would carry out random sampling of usually a plant, but it could be a sedentary animal like a limpet, in response to an abiotic factor such as soil pH or light level or moisture level. The most important things to remember here are to make sure that you do include that abiotic factor, because quite often people forget and miss this bit out, and also making sure that your method will actually give you randomly sampled data. It's not sufficient to talk about throwing a quadrat over your shoulder, as this won't actually give you random data. So to have that randomly sampled data, our first step is to create a grid, and you would usually do this using tape measures, and then you're going to assign each square a number or some coordinates. Then you need to use some method of randomly generating your samples. So if you've numbered the squares individually, you could use a random number generator. But another thing that you could do is you could have dice that you roll to do the coordinates. So if it was a 6x6 grid, you could have the first dice being for the horizontal axis and the second dice being for the vertical axis, for instance. Then for each of the squares that you've identified as being sampled, you place a quadrat in that square, and depending on the kind of species that you're sampling, you might just count the number of plants of that species. Or if it's something that kind of grows more widely, like moss or clover, you might use a quadrat that has internal divisions, and you might assess percentage coverage instead. Then it's really important that you remember to assess your abiotic factor. So for instance, using a pH probe to take a reading of acidity at each location. A line transect is a straight path usually ruled out with a tape measure along which organisms are sampled at regular intervals. So for instance, you might create a transect and then put a quadrat down every 5 metres or every 10 metres and sample there. So you're sampling systematically rather than randomly. It's generally more appropriate to do this when you're sampling a factor that is gradually changing. So for instance, if you're looking at a river or the sea and looking at how the distribution of organisms changes depending on how far away you are from it, because you know that the moisture content is going to decrease as you get further away from that body of water. Or for another example, you might start in a wooded area and move your way out into an open area and assess light levels as you go. Inter-specific competition is between different species, and this is always going to be competing for a resource. So that could be something like food or shelter, or if we're talking about plants, then it could be light. When organisms intra-specifically compete, then that's within their own species. Now, obviously, you can still compete with someone from your own species for food or for shelter or for light, but added into that, there's also competition for mates. And this could also include competing for a territory in order to make yourself more attractive to those mates. Adaptations are physical or behavioural features that enable an organism to survive in the conditions where it normally lives. If you're living in a polar environment, then an organism might have adaptations such as its fur, which is likely to be thick. It could be white for camouflage. It could be hollow to trap air, which is again going to help insulate it. They might have layers of blubber, again for insulation, or black skin to better absorb any radiation from the sun. And they often have a small surface area to volume ratio. And this can also mean things like having very, very small ears. They may also have behavioural adaptations such as huddling. Organisms living in the desert, animals living in the desert, are likely to have reduced sweating. They're likely to have a large surface area to volume ratio, such as having large ears, and they may exhibit nocturnal behaviour. In other words, they only come out at night when it's cooler. Extremophiles are organisms that live in extreme environments, such as high temperature, pressure, or salt concentration. And one example of an extremophile are the bacteria that live in deep sea vents. The main producers of biomass for life on Earth are photosynthetic organisms, and these producers are found first in food chains. Examples include green plants and algae, and these organisms capture energy by absorbing light using the chlorophyll in their chloroplasts. The arrow in a food chain represents the transfer of energy. A primary consumer is an organism that eats a producer, and they're also known as herbivores. A secondary consumer eats a primary consumer and is also known as a carnivore. Carbon can be removed from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, by green plants and algae, also by dissolving in the oceans, the creation of fossil fuels when both plants and animals over millions of years break down to make crude oil and coal and gas, and also the creation of sedimentary rocks. This happens mainly from carbonates which plankton have used to make their shells. The carbon-containing molecule that plants make using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is, of course, glucose, and the energy for this process comes from sunlight, which is absorbed by the plant's chlorophyll in the chloroplasts. If there's enough glucose for it to be stored, because it's not all being used for respiration, then it can be stored as starch, and starch is insoluble, which means it doesn't dissolve, and therefore it doesn't affect the osmotic pressure in the cells and doesn't cause water to move around. It's possible for carbon to move from animals, plants and microorganisms back to the atmosphere by decomposition. Carbon moves from animals to plants when the animals eat the plants. It can also be used to create fossil fuels, or it could be released by decomposers when they respire. A carbon sink is somewhere that carbon is locked up, such as in fossil fuels, sedimentary rocks, the ocean and peat bogs. Carbon dioxide levels rising is concerning because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and therefore the increase in its levels are leading to global warming. Water moves from the sea to the atmosphere when it evaporates, and this happens faster when the sun is shining because this is going to warm up the water and speed up the process. When that water vapour is in the atmosphere, it condenses to form clouds. Biodiversity is the variety of different species either on Earth or just within a particular ecosystem. And it's important because the greater the biodiversity, the greater the stability of that ecosystem. This is because it reduces the dependence of one species on another. In other words, if an organism has two potential food sources rather than just one, if one of those food sources is removed, then it's not going to lead that second organism to completely die out. Humans are impacting the environment in many ways. This could be because of our rapid population growth, our increased standard of living, which is putting pressure on the environment, or also our ineffective waste disposal. Sewage, fertilisers and toxic chemicals are all responsible for polluting waterways, while smoke and acidic gases are polluting the atmosphere, and our landfill is polluting the earth, and all of these are having knock-on impacts on biodiversity. 4 ways in which humans are reducing land availability include building, quarrying, farming and dumping waste. Peat bogs are being destroyed for compost and also for fuel, and this is important because it reduces available habitat and also contributes to increased carbon dioxide levels. Deforestation is the process of chopping down trees. This may be done because we want the space either for building or more usually for farming of cattle, rice and biofuels, or it could be because we want the timber, and this could be as a building material or just to make paper. Deforestation is going to affect the atmosphere because there are fewer trees taking in carbon dioxide in order to do photosynthesis, but also because there's a large amount of carbon locked up in those trees. So if they've been chopped down because we want the space rather than because we actually want the wood, they're often just left to decay, and that carbon is going to be released by microorganisms called decomposers as they respire, and they release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. 3 greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane and water vapour. These greenhouse gases may lead to global warming, and effects of this include flooding, extreme weather events such as hurricanes, the loss of polar habitats, extinctions of different species, and also crop failures leading to famine. Are trying to reduce their impact on biodiversity, and this can be done using breeding programs for endangered species, which is something that a lot of zoos and conservation efforts do, by protecting and also regenerating rare habitats, by reintroducing field margins and hedgerows around farms, so that rather than just having really large landscapes that have a monoculture where there's only one type of crop, there's more diversity and there's a wider variety of habitats, by reducing deforestation, and also by increasing recycling of resources rather than dumping it all in landfill. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you found this a useful contribution to your revision for GCSE Combined Science or Biology. Don't forget to check out the rest of the videos in the series, particularly if you're taking GCSE Biology, in which case you also need to watch the Triple Science only video. If you did find this useful, then don't forget to like and subscribe for more GCSE Biology revision videos coming soon.